learning to see what's in front of me. On the many mornings I played tennis with my dad in City Park, we got there by driving down Napoleon Avenue, and after a few turns, followed South Jefferson Davis Parkway, an avenue with a grassy neutral ground toward Canal Street, the thoroughfare that runs from one end of New Orleans to the other. In New Orleans, we don't have medians, but neutral grounds. Though I hadn't known it growing up, the words come from the literal neutral territorial lines of the ethnically based 19th century municipalities that used to divide New Orleans, the French Creoles, and free people of color on one side and white Anglo-Americans on the other. Rarely, if ever, on those drives at sunrise did I pay attention to the statue of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, in a statesman-like pose atop a granite pedestal facing Canal Street. I also ignored the name of the street, I guess. I had, of course, studied the Civil War in school, or so I thought. The real problem is I wasn't taught much at all. My middle school and high school history classes consisted of lessons about the various battles of the war. We learned that the war between the states was as much about economics and states' rights as anything, certainly more so than slavery. That fighting for your state was more important back then because the nation was relatively young. There was little to nothing on the morality of slavery, even at Jesuit. Barely a passing mention on Reconstruction, and then not much acknowledgement of Jim Crow before we swiftly moved on to World War I. I knew that Davis had died in New Orleans in 1889, but on those morning drives in the late 1970s, I had yet to learn that the United Daughters of the Confederacy raised funds to erect the statue on land donated by the city of New Orleans in 1911. The Jefferson Davis Memorial Association welcomed any, quote, white person, close quote, of good moral character to its ranks, as I read many years later. I barely even saw the statue. Jefferson Davis was there, but not there, as we drove by. In countless conversations with white friends and supporters, I've learned that most of them passed the Davis Monument in the same mentally distant way. Davis's life was so long ago that it had little bearing on the lives that we led. And yet, as I discovered when Confederate monuments became such an explosive issue for me, city officials in 1911 had a strategy for those totemic pieces. They believed in white supremacy. As time passed and racial attitudes changed, their beliefs still stood there for others to see. The history we learned was a purposefully false history. Think about this fact. About a quarter of the people in New Orleans in 1911 were African American. They had no voice in the decision. Few of them could vote, and even fewer were in any position of political power. As the decades went by, and whites passed the statue with scant interest, Jefferson Davis memorialized a living message for many African Americans. In 2010, when I was first elected mayor, New Orleans had a 60% black citizenry and a rich, flourishing African American culture, vital to our economy. But in the first few years of my term, I honestly didn't think much about the presence of Confederate monuments. The big hurdle was to jumpstart the rebuilding process after Hurricane Katrina had left my city on life support. In 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed, protests sometimes began and ended at the statue of Jefferson Davis or in Lee Circle, where Robert E. Lee stands on a huge pedestal at a major traffic juncture. It heated up as the country struggled with police violence from Ferguson to New York to Baltimore. The statues were often tagged with spray paint: Black Lives Matter, R.I.P., BLM, No Justice, No Peace. Our departments of property management or sanitation often had to go out to clean the graffiti. The connection did not seem as obvious to me at that point. Meanwhile, I had begun to talk extensively at home and nationally about the issue of the murders of and by young black men. I was frustrated that there was so much passion and attention being given to police brutality, which was real, and yet very little to something I knew was a sign of the indifference to black lives. The statues seemed like a fringe issue, brought up by a small group of activists from time to time, though they didn't call them symbols of oppression or monuments to white supremacy. To be honest, I didn't fully understand that connection to today's protest. I didn't know my own history.